Hello, welcome to Side by Side. Hi, okay? All right, we're getting started on time. Thank you for being here. I'm Rebecca Karcher. Janet Altmeyer and I have tried to put together a series that would be interesting to all y'all called Side by Side, Stepping Away from Judgment. And we're so pleased that you're here today. Our speaker today, oh, wait, I should do the housekeeping stuff. Snacks, water over here. Bathrooms down the hall on the left, and down a couple steps, yes. I believe Chris's presentation is going to be an hour-ish, and then there'll be some time for Q&A. So we're using microphones to be recorded. Joe has been editing our videos and putting them on YouTube and on our website, so if you know somebody that would be interested in these topics and isn't able to join us at this time, feel free to point them toward the website. So today's side-by-side discussion is what's with all the pronouns, right? A lot of people are, for the first time recently, seeing individuals identify themselves with pronouns that may or may not have been the one you expected that person to say, and some of them use they. What is that? So I went right to the expert, local expert. You know that nationally and politically, there's all kinds of discussion around these kinds of topics going on, but locally, we have neighbors who are dealing with this kind of misunderstanding, intentional or not, polite, impolite, intentional or not. Chris is going to talk to us today. Chris Wise is the clinical director at the BRAVE Alliance, and I want to just tell you that BRAVE is an acronym for Building Radically Accepting and Validating Environments, right? Radically accepting. And there's also, I hope he mentions the BRAVE Center that is going to be literally our neighbor and be a welcoming place for younger people who need a place to be welcomed and feel comfortable. Chris earned a bachelor's degree in social work from the University of St. Francis and a master's degree in social work from Indiana University. He's the clinical director with the Allen County Drug and Alcohol Consortium and co-owner of Ally Counseling and Consulting. Along with DAC, he provides mental health therapy and support at the BRAVE Alliance. So Chris has over 20 years experience in direct practice, leadership, program evaluation, and advocacy. He's worked in various areas of community-based practice in HIV, mental health and addictions, and child welfare. Clinical practice areas of focus include serving the LGBTQ community and survivors of childhood trauma. Chris was also named the NASW, National Alliance of Social Workers, Social Worker of the Year in 2018 for Indiana Region 3. I assume he's only gotten better with time, so.
I hope so anyways.
Now Chris Wise is here to speak with us.
Well, thanks for joining us on this cloudy Thursday afternoon. I really like to be able to present on Tuesday afternoons because then I can reference the Moody Blues, but we're on a Thursday, so I guess I don't have a good reference for Thursday afternoons. But thank you for being here. I didn't know what kind of a crowd to expect, but this is great turnout, I think, for a good conversation. So I've got like formal slides prepared, and we may use some of them and we may not use all of them, but I wanted to have some just in case there's different questions that might come along that might give a good visual reference to. So we already did some introductions. I will talk about what the BRAVE Alliance is doing. We're going to go over a little bit of like gender paradigm stuff. Why are there so many options with pronouns? And with that, little pronouns overview, history of pronouns and how it's developed, and singular use of they, which I think is what probably throws people off the most in conversation and whatnot. So part of the reason why they were talking to me about titles beforehand. So the BRAVE Alliance is a program of the Drug and Alcohol Consortium here in town, which goes by the acronym DAC. So with that program, I'll be providing the clinical services, and then we have some additional staff and interns that are going to help with some of our support and drop-in center activities, as well as some of the education that we're going to do for the community. So one of the reasons why Fort Wayne was awarded this grant through the Division of Mental Health and Addictions is because Fort Wayne scores really low on resources for the LGBTQ plus community. So low we actually scored the lowest in the state. So it's not, we always want to be like, at least middle ground, somewhere in a 1 out of 3 batting average. If we could be batting 300, that'd be great, but we're at 40 out of 100 points. So they assess different municipalities. So we scored the lowest in Indiana, so we got some work to do, but this grant's going to help us do some of that work. So we're going to be doing some education for medical and mental health providers so that we can improve our capacity of how many mental health and medical professionals are able to provide some safe, affirming care. And then we have free mental health services and groups. We're also going to have a free library that's focusing on LGBTQ plus authors and BIPOC authors as well. So different fun stuff will be happening. We're still in the process of kind of renovating our space. I think we've done everything but masonry thus far in our DIY of nonprofit work. But we will have our grand opening on April 14th for the public to come celebrate our venture with us. So, as Rebecca said with our,
Just want to know, where is that?
it is at 534 West Berry Street. So we're literally neighbors here just down the way. We are in the lower level of the West Berry Apartments.
Used to be the urban heavy.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Feels like a lot of free advertising for them. I've said that a lot of times.
Yes. Yeah, I really,
It is a cool store.
yeah, they have no idea. We've been talking about them so much. So with our acronym and looking at, when we talk about being radical, it really is a way to challenge ourselves. Like, how can we be radical with our own thoughts and our own knowledge and what we want to continue to grow and learn? So some of that is going to be kind of deconstructing how we think about gender today. So to kind of start, gender is a social construct. So social constructs are things that we've created as human beings to kind of help us identify things and have context to our culture. So some of those examples might be money, how we define national origin, race, age, intelligence, beauty, and gender. So all of those things we've created kind of categories and hierarchies for in human behavior as well as within our cultures. So the nice thing about it when we think about human constructs is they've continued to change over time. Before we had a national currency, we would trade with furs and I don't know, what did we trade for? Gold? I don't know. I just always think of furs. Davy Crockett type of things. I don't know. Corn? Yeah, okay. I always want pie. Whatever I'm trading, I want pie back. So as we've continued to evolve as a species and as a culture, we've changed these different dynamics over time. So when we think about the gender paradigm, this is where I try to tell people, like, so what we've been explained is really false. They tried to really simplify it for us because our brain likes binary things. We like things to be black or white or yes or no. Like gray areas, we don't like it's frustrating. We're like, I don't know what the right answer is. So within that gender paradigm of how we've thought about it in culture, it's difficult for folks to kind of separate the difference between sex and gender because we use them interchangeably often, but it is different. So when we think about sex, we're actually looking at how are we identifying someone at birth, of whether they're male, female, or intersex. And we'll talk a little bit more about intersex in a little bit. So when a child's born, they're actually looking at the genitalia to identify what they think that genitalia most looks like. Because genitalia is like snowflakes. Everybody's is different. We're not going to do any mirrors or anything. People got nervous usually when I would say that back a couple of years ago. I was like, no. We're just going to identify that everybody's like snowflakes. But that also means we have ambiguous genitalia at birth that has to be identified or classified, which can lead to some ongoing problems long term. Lots of different, intersex would be a whole other thing, and I'm not an expert in it, but we try to make things really cut and dry, and it doesn't work that way. We could have someone could have an exterior penis and also have ovaries. and would not know it until, like, does everybody get an abdominal scan? No, I don't. Like, until there's some need for it, we don't look for those types of things unless there's an issue. So gender is going to then refer to our social roles, how we identify ourselves personally, and that expression of how do we express what our gender is. So that gender expression piece is what our outward kind of engagement is, because we want people to affirm and treat us as how we identify our gender within our cultural norms. Gender identity is that internal awareness of what your gender is. And then neurological sex is actually what our brain tells us we are. And the interesting part about neurological sex and how we're moving towards classifying things that way is because, not because male and female brains are so different, but we can identify gender dysphoria neurologically. So we can, if they did a nice little scan or MRI, CAT scan of my brain, I think they used an MRI, they would be able to identify gender dysphoria in my brain. Like where it lives in the same area, back right-hand side, same area of the brain as where we see individuals who have experienced combat trauma and have lost a limb. That area will be enlarged and there's some enhanced activity there. So it'll tell them, even though that arm might be gone, it feels like their arm is there. So gender dysphoria lives in that same area of the brain and is telling us that we have some incongruence with what our brain is telling us should be happening with our body and how our physical body presents. So typically we think of things as very binary. It just makes it simple. It's going to be do male and female. But unfortunately that leaves out about 7 billion people. So when we think about 199 million, out of 7 billion people, about 199 million people we're leaving out. So there are a lot of people with genitalia that would be classified as intersex. So this gives us more of like a bell curve idea of how much of a population. So when we think about even people identifying as a gender expansive population of being non-binary or trans, we're talking about pretty small populations historically. 1.7% of the population would be intersex, and it's our estimates of experiencing gender dysphoria is somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of the population. Historically, that we've been able to identify. It is hard to make those estimates because we are left out of most large data collections within our culture. So it's hard to kind of make that estimate. One of the estimates, a comparison would be having gender dysphoria is about the same rate as someone having red hair. So as you think about engaging in your life, oh, that's perfect. Thank you for coming. Yeah. So that's about, because it is actually a recessive gene when we look at, we map out the human genome that gives us gender dysphoria. So when we think about over time, we've learned more about intersex and how to best wait and not do surgical interventions, where they would typically do surgical interventions for a lot of intersex infants during infancy and early childhood, multiple series of surgeries, and historically that has not gone well. So they've stopped doing that because we're literally just taking a guess instead of waiting to find out what the person's gender identity is. So it makes some pretty irreparable things happen. So we've bettered our medical practice in that. So when we think about like language over time and where our pronouns have historically kind of fallen, 17th century singular use of they was accepted. Like sometimes we're bringing back, it's new again. 1850s gender neutral pronouns in newspapers. I don't know how to pronounce all of those, but ze, fi, o, nay was commonly used in newspapers as pronouns. 1880s, we made an attempt to use one gender neutral pronoun, which didn't become popular, which was thon instead of like they.
Hard to see why that failed.
Right? Yeah. I'm kind of glad, I don't know what else was going on in the 1880s, but 1970s in the feminist movement, a lot of people would use they. 2010s, we started seeing ze, her, and ze, zer coming into practice. Didn't catch on as easily, and I think one of the reasons is because people don't know how to necessarily pronounce that when they see it, whereas they is easier for people to understand because it's part of our language. We're not introducing a new word to a lot of people. So we can see kind of like how our language and variables of that have varied over time, of what we've used in different situations and contexts. Does that surprise anybody?
They being acceptable in the 17th century does surprise me. That is, yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I didn't know that either until I started looking into it. So I'm like, yeah, because we act like it's very new, but
Exactly.
but we're not from the 17th century, so it's all right. You know, we're. So Shakespeare used the singular use of they quite often. Now you're
You
embarrassed?
should have known that. Yeah, now it's
Oh.
like, well, when's the last time I read Shakespeare? But anyway.
Right. Yes. Yeah, and all the Shakespeare I had to memorize in high school. None of it. I don't think had any theys in it, but I. So we can see the kind of the use of singular they over time. 19th century, they identified, and this author identified some non-sexist singular they. Again, probably most likely with the feminist movement, and looking at how we identify some of those gender differences. And I think as we get into a little bit about chromosomal sex, you'll see how that kind of aligns a little bit with when we started classifying things a little bit differently. So one of the things I want to make sure everybody's aware of is when we think about people using they as their pronoun, it doesn't necessarily mean they're non-binary. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily gender fluid or even identifying within the LGBTQ community. We're seeing it a lot in larger cities, but I'm seeing it here in Fort Wayne at times where people who use she, they, or he, they as part of challenging the larger paradigm of oppression that we're under. So I like that trend. I think we should question the oppression that we're all under and different ways of healthily challenging that and pointing it out, because we shouldn't assume, as well as should someone in power define what it means to be a man or a woman. I mean, that varies greatly for everybody. So we've got our subject, object, possessive aspect, pronunciation. Anybody English teachers in here? Anybody? No? Okay.
Let's remove it.
Oh, sweet, sweet. And then we have our gender neutral, and we often refer to these down here as our neo-pronouns. And they, I think it was it 2019 or 2020, they was the word of the year from Webster's Dictionary, because they were really proud of they making a comeback. Like, it's a simple word, but it's challenging a lot of things. So that'll give you the pronunciations to the side here. Neopronouns, I don't see a lot of youth identifying with neopronouns locally, but that's always subject to change.
That was Webster's phoning in.
Yeah, sweet. They're like, thank you, Chris. Urban Hippie's gonna call next. And be like, thanks for the plug. There's a great book by Dennis Barron that's called What's Your Pronoun? Beyond He and She, that gives a lot of the historical context that I'm pulling is from that text. But I think we're gonna start seeing more neopronouns locally in our community. It'll be a mix, I think, but now that people are able to conceptualize they, and that we don't have to classify everybody black and white with he and she, I think we might see a little more emergence of the neopronouns. So one of the things when we think about why we need they, or neopronouns in general, is that we've been given a lot of myths about sex chromosomes. So for a while there, they were saying like men's and women's brains are different. not so much. We're all socialized and developed differently. So a lot of what our environment impacts how our brain is used in different ways. Like women tend to have better fine motor skills because of play in early life. So that's how our brain is developing and looking different and looking gendered, but there isn't actually a difference in male or female brains. So when we look at our chromosomes, in the 60s we decided that it was just going to make it easiest for everybody if we just said that X and Y are the chromosomes that we're going to think about, and that's what determines sex. But if you see this chart here, which we don't really have time to go into all today, but this is what determines sex amongst chromosomes. So you can have, that's not the next slide. So you could have XX or XY, but not have the body of a person who is XX or XY naturally when you're born. Like it doesn't always, not everything is always congruent. Sometimes I'll use you could plant an oak tree in your yard and it's not going to look like the oak tree at your neighbor's house because we are all made in nature. We all have cells and it just doesn't work that way. Like as much as we have variation in plants and flowers, we have those same variations within human beings. But we often just see the exterior and we don't know, unless typically people do not realize that their sex chromosomes may not match the sex they were assigned at birth, unless they have issues with having children. Like we don't have any tests or anything that we run on people to say, okay, we've got all your paperwork. Medical care doesn't work that way. That's not, we're still working on basic challenges in medical care, and access. So there's a lot of things that are unknown that we automatically just kind of assume about our existence. So when we look at the genetics of gender identity and dysphoria, it's important that we have more than just 2 pronouns to choose from. So when we look at DNA analysis, there's 21 rare genes that are all found in common amongst individuals that experience gender dysphoria. They're not found in cisgender people. So cisgender means if you were identified female at birth and that's your gender identity, as female, you would be cisgender, which means, I think it becomes from the Latin phrase of meaning congruent or the same. So then transgender or gender expansive, I like the term gender expansive because it's not everyone transitions. Not all transitions look the same when we look at gender affirming care. So it gives us that nice language of being inclusive with everybody. So in those gene variants, I want to note, because it's important that we note it, the same genes within those gene variants that cause gender dysphoria are often what we see. They're the same gene variants that bring us ADHD, ADD, OCD, schizophrenia, and autism. So when we look at the populations of people that experience all of those different medical diagnoses, it falls in line with the same about rates of population of folks that experience gender dysphoria. So one of the things we'll be having at the Brave Alliance is the Autism Ally will be having one of their groups eventually in our space that'll be for gender expansive youth who are autistic but also identify as non-binary or trans. So the gene location, all of that can be important as we look at just really being open and understanding, even if you've ever met someone who's autism or with autistic community at all, there's a lot of gender norms that are broken just naturally within that community. And some of that, and typically in the past we would just be like, well, they don't understand social norms, that's what it is. No, we're actually getting folks who are now telling us like, that's not who I am. Or I don't want to fall within this binary. I can express myself how I want. So gender dysphoria is the medical term we use to identify when there is that incongruence between assigned gender and gender identity. in order to reach that diagnosis, you have to go to a mental health professional or your physician, and we go through an assessment with you. It has to include some insistence, persistence, and consistence of not having congruence with how you were identified as your sex at birth. And it has to cause some clinically significant distress for you. Any questions about that? There's two common times when we see presentation of there being gender dysphoria. It's usually between the ages of 3 and 5, when we're starting to realize that developmentally we start realizing that there's boys and girls and how we classify things socially, as well as the onset of adolescent and puberty times when things start changing. Dysphoria can pop up there because our bodies are changing and those secondary sex characteristics are being solidified.
Could you go back to that slide just briefly, please?
Sure.
When you say that, or when the slide indicates that it can lead to clinically significant psychological distress and impairment in the main areas of functioning.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say we've got a child entering kindergarten. Can you just give us 2 or 3 types of behavior that might lead us to ask these questions?
Sure. Social withdrawal, not being able to have healthy relationships with your peers because you don't fit within. So if I'm a kindergartner going into kindergarten and I've been assigned female, but I identify as male, and I may vocalize that or I may not, but if I am drawn towards male activities, but the other males in my class don't embrace me participating in that, it can create some social isolation. So we'll see depression at a young age. And when we think of the clinical significant factors of things, a lot of people would describe it as depression and anxiety, but when we treat it with the depression and anxiety medications, it's not effective because it is a separate issue of what's happening. So, and gender dysphoria is different for everybody. For those folks who knew me prior to taking gender affirming steps, they have described that I'm much calmer, I'm much nicer, and I don't have a heaviness about me. Whereas before I was carrying a lot of depression that I don't take any antidepressants, not doing anything. But until you address the actual gender dysphoria. And a lot of, even with presenting very masculine or androgynous, I guess some people might have said, that wasn't enough. There's still a heaviness of depression, depressive-like symptoms, and distress. Your body is constantly in distress, so even if you're like, oh, I'm having a good day, I'm calm, and your body is not feeling calm at any point.
Right. So just so I understand it, I think I do. You're saying that whether it's in the kindergarten age or the puberty age, there probably is going to be depression just because of the fact you're feeling withdrawn and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But you still have the separate problem with the gender dysphoria.
Yes.
There are 2 separate things that you have going on. So when
Yep.
you hear a lot of things going on now saying that, well, if we keep people from going through the transition or the blockers or things like that, and then we can go back and treat the mental health issues, well, that's totally wrong because obviously, yeah, for sure you're going to be treating mental health issues, but
Yeah.
there's still this other undiagnosed issue that you're still dealing with.
You said that perfectly, yes. So when we think about the 2 being separate, we have to treat the gender dysphoria. And I mean, often we think about it anxiety and depression, but what that is underlying trauma that's not being addressed. So, yeah, so when we think about just not fitting in, no matter where you go, how much trauma is that causing to somebody on a daily basis? And not like traumatic event-wise, but ongoing trauma and discomfort of not fitting in. The world isn't accepting of me, the world doesn't see me. Like being seen and heard is like 90% of therapy. The other 10% is like, okay, what modality do we need to use here to help you get well faster? And when we think about, I know there's a lot of political discussion on blockers and things. When the World Professional Association of Transgender Health has had guidelines since the 40s of how we go about treating gender dysphoria. Medical intervention is the only effective thing. People can talk to me in therapy for the rest of their life, and it's not going to do anything until we see some relief medically. We don't do surgeries on anybody under the age of 18 unless it's extreme circumstances. When they tote some of those numbers of like, well, there's this so many youth, there was a stat I saw not too long ago from the Plastic Surgeon Association that there was 13,000 genital affirming surgeries that weren't amongst trans youth, but falling into that intersex population of, I want my genitalia to look like my peers in my life. Or I'm not happy with my breast size. So there's youth that can have breast implants before the age of 18. So they're misconstruing some of that information because we don't do surgical interventions for people under the age of 18. To get hormone blockers, you have to be approved by your physician and at least one mental health therapist. Most insurances are going to require you to go see 2 different people for assessment before the insurance will say, yes, we're going to pay for those. So it's a lengthy process, and really puberty blockers is like push and pause. And I use that like old-time tape recorders. We could just push pause, and it gives us time to wait and see what we need to do. There are different theories about why this bothers people, that we can do puberty blockers. One of the biggest areas I think it is that socially we are less likely to be able to determine that that person was transgender if we use puberty blockers, because we're halting some of the development of secondary sex characteristics. They will, what we call in the trans community, they will pass much easier, and you will not know that that person was identified differently at birth. I think in our culture we like to be able to point out and say that person's trans, I know it, rather than allowing people to have the same opportunities and equality and equity within our communities to blend in, so to speak. Does that make sense? Okay.
And this is happening in 2 of the most important times of our development.
Yeah, adolescence is already hard, right? Like, I think we can all, nobody wants to go back. No one's like, I want to go back to 6th grade. No. It's never on anyone's bucket list. Yeah, it's difficult in general with everything. So when we add stuff to it, it's why we see so many suicidal youth. And that's where pronouns can be game-changing for some folks. So when we think about gender dysphoria, the reason why it's so different for everybody, between my experience or someone else who's trans, is because it has physical, social, and emotional components. So for example, regardless of what pronouns people use for me, it doesn't trigger anything in me socially. Don't know why, just how my brain is. So still to this day, one of my old coworkers is like, dang it, and I'm like, didn't notice. And some people will that'll be very triggering for them to have someone use the wrong pronoun for them in public. So when we think about those different aspects, that's why some people are like, they's fine, or just don't call me bad words or anything offensive. It doesn't, but it can make it really confusing when you're trying to do the right thing. Yeah.
I'm curious of how the best way to respond. I was getting coffee one day, and just how I was raised up, I said, thank you, sir, through the thing as I was coming around. And then I noticed that this person was likely identifying as she, her. And it was like this awkward, and now in the moment, I didn't say anything because it's like, well, so what do you say, or should you say anything in a space like that? Because I say that out of respect and love, and then realizing that, oh boy, that could have been hurtful or...
Yeah, I think if you catch it, especially, if you're in the drive-thru at Starbucks and you see someone wearing a pronoun pin, then just correct yourself when you see them face to face.
Wearing a what kind of pin?
A pronoun pin. So sometimes folks will wear a pin that'll tell you their pronouns on it. Or you use, the biggest thing is just be kind. So if we do mess up, I think it's just, it's almost worse when, okay, I'm going to say it. It is worse if someone makes a big deal out of it, and then like I've had people like cry, and I'm like, I don't know why you're crying. It's okay. Like, it's not about you. I know you're a kind person. Everything's fine. Just correct yourself, and it makes it a lot easier for everybody. Because I think making it a big scene then just like raises everybody's anxiety, and we just want to be seen. And once you saw them, you're willing to make the correction, and that's what people need for that affirming aspect. Yeah.
Don't be that person who wants to back up in the Starbucks. Sorry.
The downtown Starbucks, it's rough. That parking lot's rough. You know? Some social dysphoria will come with not being engaged in the same manner as how someone identifies. And it can be as simple, so one of the things that socially I'll catch myself and I'm like, that's not how somebody means it, is if someone opens the door for me. And I don't know why that triggers me, but that's something that people would typically do for individuals who are female or are expressing themselves as female. And part of me, I don't know if it's just like, I can get that door myself, or if it's dysphoria. I don't know which one it is, but because I tend to like to, Corinne will tell you, all week, she's like, let me do this for you. I'm like, I can do it myself. I'm working on it. So it's a matter of like pulling that apart of, is it tapping into what those social norms are regarding gender in our culture, or am I just stubborn? Physical distress, it's why we have a lot of apparatuses that we continue to evolve to try to flatten chests for individuals who have chest dysphoria if they were identified as female at birth. There's different prosthetics that we can use, would give people more hips, all kinds of different things. One of the things that people don't talk about widely when we think about all the political things that are happening around gender affirming care is that before people had access to gender affirming care, I would get calls from parents who were in distress because their child had used, typically high school kids age, had used hardware-grade silicone to try to create and reduce some of that gender dysphoria. So people would do what's called pumping parties, where they would use hardware-grade silicone to enhance breasts or hips, buttocks, lips, a lot of, to soften the brow up here, it's very unsafe. It's, obviously, it's from the hardware store. It's not even medical-grade silicone. So when we talk about people not having access, these are the things that I worry about. Because people are like, well, what was the before time? I'm like, yeah, we don't want to talk about that. But those are risks of things we want to be aware of and keep an eye on if care is not accessible for folks. I feel like there was a CSI where they did a special on it, because it was very, very popular before the Affordable Care Act, which required insurance companies, if you were going to be on the exchange, you were then required to provide gender-affirming medical care within your policies, which is why we see more trans people, because now it's affordable. Prior to gender-affirming care being on insurance panels, people are like, Chris, you're like the only person in our generation out publicly. And I'm like, because I have privilege and I was able to afford it. This is $20,000 later. Like, somebody mentioned all my different titles. I was working a lot to make some money. I'm working less these days. But it's very, very expensive. So in Indiana, this is from the Trevor Project, does a national survey every year. They were able to, this is the first year they did it, they pulled out individual state data. Within Indiana in 2022, 54% of transgender and non-binary youth considered suicide, and 15% attempted. When I talk to my peers over at Parkview Behavioral, they feel like it's more than 15% in our community.
I read that one came out said 23% attempted suicide.
Yeah, and this is like individual state data, but what I don't know from the Trevor Project is like how much was Allen County, how much was Marion County, like where's that state pulled from? And we know that using someone's pronouns and or name that they use publicly decreases suicidal thoughts by 29%, which is a huge decrease. I mean, it really is like, okay, somebody cares. Like, somebody is respectful and sees me as for who I am, or is at least trying to get it. Like, we will, out of the hundreds of trans people that I've worked with in our community, if you're trying, we're going to give you grace. If you mess up, we're going to give you grace as long as you're trying. And it, how we feel in each other's presence will always trump whether we get the words right, as long as people are engaging and welcoming and figuring it out with us. Our language has a lot of power, and I know it's hard for people to make change around language. We have to create a whole new neural pathway in our brain for memory. It's hard, but culturally over time, we've learned what language we can or can't use when we think about things that are considered derogatory terms about race or derogatory terms about women over time, that we've been like, okay, we shouldn't use that language. And this is kind of one of those things. And really just, it's what good people do. How can we be kind to each other? I'm a big nerd, so here's all my references.
Can you put that back up?
Yes.
You're not the only nerd.
Okay.
So
Yes.
we'll put the PowerPoint on our website. with the-
Yeah, sure.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the easy ways when you're engaging somebody, and whether they present pretty non-binary or fluid, is to introduce yourself and use your pronouns, and they will tell you, they'll just, okay, great, you're safe, and they will let you know what pronouns to use for them. Yes.
So that was one of my questions, is, like on Zoom, a lot of times, you'll see people have their pronouns, and I respect that. I felt, for me, nobody would ever question, particularly since my pronouns are Her Highness.
Well, I mean, if we're gonna choose, pick whatever. I mean, why are we limiting ourselves to she, he, they? I mean,
This is where we go.
yes.
But my sister, who's a teacher in public schools, called me out on that and said, well, I put my pronouns there so other people feel comfortable putting theirs. And so, I think, well, nobody's ever going to get that wrong for me. I should still do that because then it just opens up.
You're opening the door.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's, you're affirming that my sister's right.
Yes. But I will call you Her Highness. I'm okay with that. Yeah.
I hear some questions of like, how do you introduce that, or how do you do that? So like, how would you go about that?
Yeah.
You mean like conversationally?
Yeah, when is it necessary?
Yeah, I definitely get on like my email or something like that, but if you're just in conversation with someone, are you suggesting using it in that sense too? How do you go about it?
If it's someone that I haven't met, I would ask them what their pronouns are. Yeah.
Initially?
Yep. Yeah.
I know.
Or how would you like me to address you? Like if someone's name is William, do we always call him William? Sometimes we call him Bill or Billy. So even just in that general sense of like, hi, I'm Chris. How would you like me to address you? What's your name?
For some of our volunteers here, typically we have some kind of name tag, but we could add, we can add that to your name tag, just so that the people we're meeting from the community who don't know us would see,
Yeah. Would you add, like, what would you add?
well, you decide that for yourself, but it would say she and her, right?
Yeah, it can be.
She,
Yeah.
her, hers.
Well, you know what, I'm not an English teacher, but I'm having a little trouble with some of this grammar. Yeah.
Can I please tell my they story?
Sure.
So my they story, the Pastor Ernest is going to punch me in the face for saying. Oh, I just can't use they for singular. If you walked in here and there was a wallet right here, you would say, someone left their wallet. We need to find them. That's using they for a single person.
Oh, yeah.
So that's all you're doing, if that makes sense. So that helps you. Right.
Yeah.
They
So,
must have left it.
Right.
Yeah. So we do use it in the singular. We just don't even recognize it because we're so familiar with doing that. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure I would say that. I would say, we need to find him.
Okay.
Or, yeah. I wouldn't
It's all right,
say-
Barb.
But you wouldn't
So-
say.
Well, what if it was a water
they?
bottle?
No.
What
Yeah,
would you
I
say?
said we need to find they. Yeah.
Are you saying because you would see the card or identification
And
that
that probably
says
belonged to one person.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Barb, you know, both parents, English teachers, I feel.
How do you feel about the Oxford comma? Sorry.
So, one way that I am working into this language is that I have a godchild who moved to Seattle because my godchild was born Allison, now identifies as non-binary and prefers the pronoun they. At first, this has been probably 12 years now, that her mother, my best friend, and I are using, who used to be Allison is now Salem. Salem's preferred pronoun being they. We are now using they. Was there a little bit of a nail on the chalkboard at first because of being brought up the way I have been? Yeah, yes, there was. But now I'm trying to become more comfortable in the mindset and living into the fact that if I'm a little bit uncomfortable using a pronoun that is unusual for my traditional patterns of thinking, think about how Allison, now Salem, has had to navigate life. And my small level of discomfort that I'm getting more comfortable with now can remind me to be extra kind.
Well, you know, it's not that I don't want to respect how they're feeling. It's just hard, and I know I'll make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
You know, me too.
But I'm hearing Chris say, your kind heart, which is
Yes.
there 24/7, will also come through. And I think if we're trying this together, the people in this room, we can support one another in trying to use language that is kind first. And if it's uncomfortable or we have to back up in the Starbucks line, because we want to do right by how the person identifies. That's what is being kind. And I mean, it is not the first. It's not the first name or pronoun that I go to, but I feel like I can work at this, and I want to do better. I actually, for a while, I had on my signature before we changed.
That's a technological.
I had she, her, hers, and one of our congregation members emailed me back and said, "Is this a joke? What's this about she, her, hers?" And I obviously, I mean, it's not something that he was fully understanding. But I mean, after having heard your presentation today, Chris, I want to do more of that because I think there's potential there to open up the conversation for so much more permission giving.
Yes, yes.
It almost reminds me, I had a coworker who English was his second language. And he made a comment to me one time because he spoke a little more deliberately, because when he spoke English, being a second language, he had to think about the English words. So this almost reminds me of that
Yep.
as you're speaking, you're almost having to think how you're saying that. So that it's almost like you're slowing down and thinking a little bit of a different language here. And thinking through that. So kind of reminds me of that when I was listening to it.
And something that can sometimes help is the pronouns take the place of a noun. We don't have to use them. We can just use people's names. Yeah.
I think, well, first and foremost, I think anyone who's sitting in this room, you're here to learn. And so you have a kind heart in that space. But one of the reasons that I came today, I remember growing up and my grandma would talk about those gay people, and she just didn't understand those gay people. And I'm thinking, what do you mean you don't understand? He likes the man, she likes the woman. Like, I don't get what the big deal is. I get it a little more now because she had not grown up with many gay people in her life or in her realm, and so she just didn't understand it. Well, that's where I feel like I am all for equality, and and that's why I'm here, because I want to learn, and working in the healthcare industry where inclusivity is one of our five values. Like, it's important to us that we can treat people well and with respect. But I now, like, I get it. I get what she meant about, I don't understand it. But until we come into conversations like these and have an open heart to learn, and how wonderful to know that from the trans community of, as long as we're trying, right? Even if we
Yeah.
mess up where we may feel like we're dying inside.
Right.
Right?
No, we're gonna go home and be like, people are getting it. People are, because it's. We were just talking when we were building the Brave Alliance. Corinne and I were talking a lot about, like, there are a lot of different norms and language and different things about gay culture in general that straight culture is not exposed to. Even if you go to a gay bar or a drag show, like, we're still in public and you're still in our space. So, like, there are a lot of things, and I think, yeah, that's where, like, I don't understand it, right? Because it's not your culture, and it really is looking at it through a cultural lens of, like, yeah, like, we may not understand everything about Burmese culture, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't reach out and learn it and embrace it. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question that's related, kind of going on the same path. Actually, two questions. But one, I just recently, I think I may have even mentioned this to you, but within the last 6 months, had a conversation with someone who was just right there with me, following along. We were talking about gender identity and youth and things like this. This individual was in their either late 60s or early 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And I used at some point, just said the word queer when I was talking about a segment of this thing that we were talking about. And as I said it, not even thinking twice about using that word, there was this moment of, I cannot believe you just said that, where I could see it on her face.
Yeah.
Because the evolution of this and how things have changed, and, you know, that being something that was hurtful and used as just, you know, whatever. So I guess because of that, my question is two-part. One, what is the Brave Alliance, what is your number one, if you had to choose one, number one most trusted, most current source for language and things like that for someone who is outside of the community? Is there a place that stays as current as can be? Because I thought in that moment, man, I wish I could just have that conversation the best I can, which I did,
Yeah.
but then to say, here's a really good website for that.
Human Rights Campaign has a lot of good resources, and they'll even break it down for, like, schools and hospitals, and they also have, like, some general terminology and stuff to kind of explain it to folks. And as we think about people using they and not identifying as trans or non-binary or gender expansive, we also have people utilizing the word queer or feeling queer and identifying with more oppressed populations because they don't fit within the patriarchy. So people might identify as queer and not be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans.
Thank you.
But they grew up in an era where you never would have said that.
Exactly.
And that, I can't imagine that word coming out of my mouth to another person.
And that's okay. You don't have to use it. That's okay.
Yeah. But what does it mean?
It's an all-encompassing word we tend to use of not fitting in within the gender or sexuality binary or expectations.
Shortcut to the LGBTQIA+.
Because it's a tongue twister, yeah. Yes.
Going back to, and you don't have to go back to the last slide, this one, talking about the statistics of how young people, teenagers, middle school students, who this is terribly important to many of them, and it should be, because number one, they're human beings,
Yep.
and they deserve to be respected like everybody else is, and they deserve to have an opinion like everybody else does. So, and a group like this, is this individual right here just mentioned, it takes time. If you're older, you were exposed to things a certain way, and you don't change overnight. You can change. But my question is, I'm going to be a young person referenced by the next to the last slide. And I'm reading the front page of the Journal Gazette today.
Yeah.
And there was an article about General Assembly Bill number so-and-so such and such.
1608? Yes.
Anything like this that helps people in general is it so quickly turns political, which is a mistake to begin with. But everybody's entitled to their own politics. But when a young person, 14 years of age, who sees people who care for them, he or she, either one, and realizes that a group like this cares, then they read something like that, and they're young, they're just forming, so they can't take it as just politics and one person's opinion, which everybody's entitled to. And to me, that will be very disheartening to a young person who wants to be recognized as who they are, choose to be, and want to be. That seems like, and it isn't going to happen overnight, I realize, but that's a big hurdle for everything that all your type of work does, which moves things forward. It just takes one article to make people feel they don't belong, or they're not part of the whole, and they are part of the whole.
Yeah, it creates a lot of shame, and shame is really hard to heal from long term emotionally, especially when it's repetitive. Prior, when trans issues first started being under debate, between 4 and 5, 6 years ago, we would see every time it would pop up in the media, the Trevor Project's hotline calls for suicide would increase. So one of the things that I worry about with our youth as a whole is that when we look at high school students, when there is a gay-straight alliance within the school, suicide rates and ideation as a whole decreases. And it communicates something of, okay, if this group over here is ostracized in our culture in some manner, but we are still loving and supportive of them, well, any of my flaws internally, even if I don't identify within that culture, are welcomed and okayed too. It creates a different level of humanity, of how we embrace each other. So if we remove any of those aspects, we're going to increase suicide rates overall with all youth. That's already high, and we're already in a mental health crisis where we don't have enough therapists to go around. So yeah, the number of people who are closeted in our community that I see who it's literally like my dad made one joke and I can't let go of that joke and that's why I can't come out, or our words hold power, and a lot of times we're internalizing a lot of things, and legislating people's right to exist is rough. Like that's, like if you asked what my goal as a human being is, I just want an average life expectancy. I just want to be able to live long enough to feel like I made it okay, and to exist, to live here, to work here, and be part of the community. And those are basic needs. We can't get to thriving as a community if we can't survive it. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The media and these bills are crippling. And even if I remove myself as like, okay, if it's not impacting me, it's just really hard to be like, how are we talking about each other and embracing each other in general as a community if we can't just acknowledge that we all just want to be here? Yeah.
Given all the things that are going on with our schools, with a concern for books in the schools and teaching sexuality and who could use a certain bathroom, do any of those alliances exist in schools now in Fort Wayne, the gay, straight?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. And the fun part about gay straight alliances is anybody comes. It's not just the gay kids or the trans kids or people who are just questioning it. Like, I think at Carroll High School this year when they had their first meeting, they had a double-sized classroom and it wasn't big enough for everybody.
Great.
Homestead's group, Pastor Perkins' child is one of the co-leaders.
Mhm. Yeah, Homestead has had, oh yeah, their group is very active and has always been large. Snyder High School has one.
When I was at Snyder, I helped facilitate that one at Snyder. I was the 9th grade guidance counselor. And we had absolutely no pushback from administrators. It had kind of died out as an organization.
Yeah.
And we went and said that we wanted to revive it and simply put it the same way as we would have if it had been a Star Trek group or
Right.
something.
Yeah.
And simply said, it's an option, and as long as we've got somebody there that's from the administration that will oversee it and sign off, and we simply sat there and facilitated, but let the students run it. And
So why
Yeah.
are we seeing legislation? I just don't get it. I just
Yeah.
don't get it. I
It's
don't
hard
get
to
it.
tell if it's even sincere or if it's just political showmanship.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Hate
and fear.
In another, under another code.
fear what they don't know.
Yeah, human behavior, we're gonna naturally fear of what we don't know, which is why it's huge you all are here. Because like, the only way to not know something is to learn it, and that's what, it always makes us better. Yeah.
Chris, can I ask you a question then, a follow-up to that statement? Because this is a conversation I have with my friends of color, is this tricky balance of it is my responsibility to educate myself as Amy, I'm speaking personally, of, you know, it's not some other oppressed person's responsibility to educate me and bring me up to speed, but also having that as on the table as conversation and something to learn and things like that. And it's something I continue to navigate. But you know, that sentiment and that statement has been very powerful for me to understand. So how does that work? I guess what I'm thinking of is, you know, as someone, can you answer that as someone with lived experience to say, what are the words, but also what's the time and the place and the setting, and what's not the time and the place and the setting, and how do you?
I would always ask the person permission.
Right.
Like, is this something you're open to talking about? I mean, I've done trainings like this on and off, and when I'm not doing them, there's a reason why. So if there's something going on with me, or I need a break from it, and it's a lot easier as well coming to a congregation that I know is open and affirming. Like, that's already a huge step of like, I'm like, okay, there's some safety. Rebecca's not going to put me in front of a firing squad. It's going to be fine. Right. So I think even just asking, but there's so many resources out there on TikTok and YouTube where you can hear people speak about their own experiences that can help educate you, where it doesn't have to be, because the burden on the individual is heavy, and there are times we got to take that off and let someone else do it.
Are there adult baseball alliances?
That's a really good question. I think it's called brunch. Sorry, I didn't warn you there, Amy. That I was but we could make one. I think we could make one. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it just creates an atmosphere of no pressure. Like, you don't have to, like, because literally, if you're a member of the LGBTQ community in this town, you're censoring yourself at work. And what you say in front of who, and who's okay to say something to, even just what you did last weekend of whether you had a date and whether you identify who that person is or not.
I'm going to form a gay straight alliance, so if anyone wants to.
I'll join.
And to be able to take some of that off and not have to use that lens at all times is a huge amount of safety, and it's important. And it keeps conversations going of just like, what's the big deal? I mean, we're all fighting in this struggle of life. Let's do it.
I mean, we've been in those conversations where somebody is saying, oh, you came back from vacation. Did you have fun? Yes, we did. My spouse and I had, it's like they're trying to be really careful not to let you know that this might be a gender pronoun that you're not going to want to hear or something. And, you know, how sad is that?
Yeah.
Those percentages, it was from the 2023 Indiana Kids Count Handbook. It was at 53.6 of the LGBTQ Hoosier kids planned suicide, and 22.5 of those attempted suicide.
Yeah. And when we look at suicidality as a whole, it isn't that people want to die, it's that they want to stop feeling like this. Yep. Yep.
So knowing that we are hosting this conversation in a church, and knowing that there are many very conservative people in the state of Indiana,
True.
the city, and many of those are my family. I mean, you know, so my question, so what I just heard you say is asking for permission. Do you want to have this conversation? Because I've had people come to me and ask me things, and I suppose they may say, well, it says in the Bible right here. And I think my response is always that I don't think it was our place to judge. I think we were called to love everyone, right? So but is there, I mean, I guess I'm kind of thinking that coming from like a Christian perspective of like, how do we help bring people to just, or
Feel free to
be
defer
more
that to the junior college.
Yeah, that's what,
Right. Well,
They're one of the, you know, and one of the challenges within the church, if I could use that kind of word, are multiple. One is that there's a real need to recognize that none of the classic tenets of Christianity, not Pentecostalism, not some branches of Protestantism, which we're part of, but truly classical Orthodox Christianity. The Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, and the Ten Commandments have absolutely nothing to do with that, with gender identity. I mean, they deal with all of us as what we would say is whole persons. Right? And we would say, in Orthodox Christianity, that those things apply to everybody, right? You can't kill other people. You shouldn't lie about them. You can't steal from them.
Love your neighbor as yourself.
You shouldn't, you know, if they're married, you shouldn't commit adultery, you know, regardless of, right? Those things are kind of across the board, you know, things that can apply to, you know, and so we miss that notion of, within Orthodox understandings of who God says, leaves those things perhaps a little more open. The second thing that we fail to realize is that what is the cultural context into which, and we're in the midst of a group, let's do it. What is the cultural context into which St. Paul, for example, is actually writing? And you know, we're working through a book by an author named Sarah Rudin, and she describes the sexual cultural context of the Greco-Roman world, which was abominable, right? Which was abominable, and even really within that world, it's, you know, who has power over who, and when you start all of a sudden seeing when St. Paul comes down hard potentially on, let's just say, homosexuality, it was about the fact that these elites, people with power, sexuality was who was allowed to penetrate who, and if you had power, didn't matter who you were, right? And she reiterates, your kid could be snatched literally off the street. As you know, he's saying in our community we don't treat human beings that way, right? Which is about the same as saying we respect them as human beings. We respect human beings as human beings, not as objects to be, you know, molested, right? And then to also then carefully say, and sometimes then we have talked about in our, you know, I remember 35 years back hearing people then thinking that if you were gay, you were a potential molester, right? Which is really laughable when you think about Christianity in the last 35 years, right? The truth of the matter is, your church was probably safer with a gay pastor than that hetero pastor. It was crazy. Especially if they were. And then really the final thing within the church context, I didn't want to hear, but really the final thing within the church context is that we have failed to build a theology around how we can accept people who don't act or look or think like me, right? We failed to build that theology. We built emotion, which is a good first step, right? I can tell you countless stories of being at meetings of pastors say, well, I can't hate gay people because my favorite nephew's gay. Okay, but what if it's not your favorite nephew?
Yeah.
Right? That's a good starting, and my sister's gay. And I lived with her in the summertime, and all her friends were gay, and this is the mid-1980s. Well, yeah, they were my friends, but I got to build a theology that includes you, not just because I like you, but because you're a human being, right? But we in the church we've stopped at feelings, but our business has to be about building the construction, right? And admittedly, we've failed to do that. Do you know? I mean,
Yeah,
Pastor Foley said,
absolutely right. That's right. Yeah.
yes, I should like you, but sometimes I don't.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I mean, one of my, here's this crazy thing. One of my gay friends who died a long time ago back in the AIDS crisis, his partner was this guy named Randy. Randy was a terrible human being, but it had nothing to do with his sexuality. Right? But so I got to build a theology that respects Randy for his sexuality, and as you should be accountable for being a terrible human being. Randy's on me all the time, right? I'm gonna pass. You understand what I'm saying, right? So the work of the church has to be within recognizing what does it truly mean to be Orthodox Christian. What does St. Paul say? What is happening in Genesis? And take those things seriously, and then build its conversation in a way that sees itself as supported.
We can all say, well, I'm certainly glad we don't live in a culture where we stone people anymore.
Well,
But I think it's as important for us to work hard, comfortable or not, to work hard at building a culture where we lead by love, and to also in that context to recognize that we have young people, kindergartners, we have, because the age of suicide is getting lower and lower and younger, and we are aware enough and acknowledge that we want to lead with love and create a theology that's surrounded by leading with love, then we want to fight any kind of culture that exists around hate or that fosters a young person, 5 or 15, that is considering taking one's own life because they feel so unloved, so unaccepted, and not worthy of being seen and heard. And I think equating those things is important for us.
Absolutely. The other final thing that registers that within a Christian community, most Christians say they take the Bible seriously. Whether or not they do, I can't be the judge of that. But a friend of mine, an author named Phyllis Tickle, who has died since she wrote this, but she wrote that we've gone through that whole idea that the Bible is our guide. That's a Reformation idea. It's Martin Luther. You're in the Lutheran church. So no, we got to get around. Right, this idea that the Bible is an authority. And she articulates that over time, we have broken so many things that the Bible, right? The Bible says slavery is okay. And we figured out a way to be faithful Christians, read the Bible, and say slavery is not okay. Many people said, and the Bible says women don't have a role in leadership. Most of us have figured out how to navigate through that and still read the Bible and still say it's okay. The Bible leads you to think that God created the world in 7 calendar days. We figured out, many of us have figured out how to navigate through that and say, and that's okay, right? And the Bible, Jesus actually kind of comes down hard on the idea of adultery, or not adultery, but divorce. And we've navigated and said, you know, we shouldn't force people to live in relationships that are not life-giving, and we figured all that out. And she makes the argument that the last one is questions of sexuality. That's the last one. And that when we finish that argument, we will have to find some other way of understanding God and authority. And that frightens a lot. Right, that frightens a lot. And whenever we're afraid, we always pick bogeymen, if you may, and trump up. That's a bad word.
But it fits, you know. Sorry.
We always stop straw people, right? We always stop straw people to pick on because it makes us feel secure. And in the church, right now, we hoist up the straw person of sexual identity because it's the last one some Christians seem to think that they're allowed to still pick on. And culturally, right? Right? We have so many crises. Let's just concentrate on who we don't like. And again, in church circles, we've fallen prey to that.
God forbid we talk about infidelity or
God.
theft or the things that are actually happening
gosh,
in
yeah.
our church.
Which
Because
the
gay
Bible
people aren't
actually-
coming because they know that they're just going to be
Right,
damned
which
all the time.
actually, those creeds of orthodoxy actually have something to say, right? Right, but let's not talk about that. Let's pick on somebody who seems to be defenseless, right? And history is littered with insecure people picking on the person that they feel safe. They feel safe to pick on because it takes all.
Because it makes them, I mean,
Because it takes all the sweat off of me.
Yeah, they're putting down someone to build up themselves.
There
for
will
whatever
always
reason.
be the bully.
Yes.
And in our circles, admittedly, right, you know, I gotta make a decision. Do I try to keep my congregation together, move forward? How pissed off can I get to that?
And still get a paycheck.
And still pay the plate bill. You know, and how do you kind of shove them down the aisle a little bit further without, it's just people that.
Thank you for what you are.
One of the things that I think is interesting when we talk about sexuality within like the Christian perspective is, I mean, I'm raised Catholic, so please forgive me if I'm misspeaking for how you all interpret things. But if Christ was 100% human and 100% divine, he also had a sexuality, and we got to get comfortable with that. He had crushes on somebody. I don't know who. But we also, when we think, even when we think about how we define sin and how people interpret that, okay, being gay is a sin, we are also assuming that person's having sex. So you're sexualizing them based on something you know about who they're attracted to. And there's plenty of people who will tell you, like, I haven't had a date in 10 years. So we need to really step back from that and kind of examine, like, what does that say about us as human beings? That I'm taking the essence of a person and their soul and whittling it down to one aspect of what they may or may not do.
You know, even within Roman Catholicism and traditional Protestantism, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Methodists, unfortunately, at least within our tradition, you were not condemned for being gay. He said you can't practice it. Now that's a whisker away, right? That's not only a whisker away from condemning, but there was not a condemnation of being gay castigated you to hell. Does that make sense? And I know we're you know, you're splitting hairs, but it's saying, you know, and the way this would be explained, you know, you might have murderous intentions, but you're not allowed to do that. But it's there was an attempt to say within the church's theology that being gay itself wasn't it. It was and it was trying to create this sort of practice and intent. And we know that there was kind of like a convoluted sort of way.
But it's a start.
But there was a kernel of a start there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the start of the conversation of like, if if God doesn't make errors and he makes this person gay, okay, we need to accept that, right?
And it was accepting the fact that this was not, you chose that, right? That we all heard that argument 30 years ago. Yeah, you know, right, you know, that you know, like if we tell a kid about this, they're going to choose to be something that they aren't, right? And at least it wasn't saying that, it was kind of a beginning of an acceptance of the notion that you are who you are.
Yeah.
Right? Unfortunately, we kind of drew a line and,
Yeah.
you know, and then castigated behavior, but it is a beginning point. Roman Catholics did not say, at least I don't believe, that you were, again, damned for being gay.
Correct, yeah. Catechism says we should be treated with reverence.
Right.
For
So, you know, then you
Yeah.
gotta take the next step, you know, but that is the beginning point, which is different than even some people are saying that, you know, you're going out gay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting where we've come, where like, yeah, all of our documentation and stuff talks very differently than how we act.
And one,
Yes.
I heard a quote from someone saying that the Bible is not the gospel, is not necessarily all-encompassing, but a lens through which we learn about God, but not necessarily the beginning and the end of what is. And that's struck me as being relevant to saying, hey, it may not be perfect. Does that make sense to anybody? Right. In a language that wasn't English.
Right, yeah, it's been interpreted and yeah.
So can you go through the okay, I get very stupid sometimes.
Me too.
This is the very basic definitions for like binary, non-binary, and some of those that you hit on.
Sure.
initially.
So like non-binary would be somebody who may not identify within on a masculine scale or on a feminine scale, but somewhere in between.
Okay.
Sometimes we'll call that gender, someone might identify as gender fluid, where sometimes they'll be presenting more masculine or feel more masculine than feminine, and they might express that differently. Gender queer is also a term that we. No, we call it something separate, but non-binary is the most common term people are using right now.
Okay, so say that again. I'm so sorry. Say that one more time.
So you may not identify as being 100% male or 100% female.
Okay.
You feel you have a mix of both.
Okay. And you term that?
Non-binary.
Non-binary, okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of non-binary folks, if you wouldn't be able to pick them out of a crowd, most likely. It's not the male who's presenting very feminine.
Okay.
It's a spectrum of expression as well as identity. Yeah.
Is there a way, I think you counsel a lot of young people, right? School age. Is there anything a church can do to signal that they're more welcoming, or that whoever you are, however you want to dress or whatever, it's okay, it's fine? I mean, is there something we can do physically?
What are there?
Like, should we take down women and men bathrooms, or, I mean,
Yeah.
And what can we put in, I mean, as we write our newsletters and those kinds of things, to be more open and affirming of others that we're talking about, and they pick up on that, because probably our language is not good in our newsletters and bulletins and those kinds of things.
It's been a while since I looked at any of your newsletters, but I think saying that you're open and affirming communicates to us that you're okay, that you're safe. Having at least one gender-neutral restroom would be ideal.
We have family restrooms.
well, we have the two down here that
I was
are
thinking
single.
these two
and
down
they
here
don't
would
need
be
to have this
excellent
many
choices for
Because they're just a
putting-
one person, each one is just a one person, and
Right.
whatever
Mhm.
the door locks is.
Does something around like Pride, I don't know if it's the festival or the facility, but do they have a listing or something maybe of?
I mean, you guys, I know, have advertised, and I think you've also maybe underwritten Pride of Pride or different events. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people know you're out there, but like socially, there aren't going to be people who come in necessarily and feel comfortable presenting in a fluid manner, or maybe not fitting within that gender binary during times of gender affirmation, just because that's not safe in our community as a whole. And there are people who come into my office and will change their clothes and then come sit down, and then change their clothes before they leave.
That's sad.
Yeah.
I think the great thing about a group like this here is we're evolving and we're learning. And when you learn, you can share. Going forward, and again, nothing happens overnight. And as Pastor Evans says, you know, Rome wasn't conquered in a day. And I'm thinking of some of Amy's students who fall into the age geographics of what we were looking at, some of the things today. And as a church, not just Amy and the youth, but as a church, back to Rebecca's question, what are things we can do going forward? Small that might end up being important big things. Could you give us some ideas in the future? It's a bit of a slippery slope, but how could we positively involve some of Amy's youth to fall into this age category when they will be able to look at this, and if it does nothing more than in their mind make them brighter, and they're bright kids to begin with, if it makes them do nothing more than stop letting somebody else bully somebody, it's a start that leads into all this as progress.
Yeah.
We're all invited to the open house, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that there's some ways that, I think, let me think on some of the ways that can communicate different things, because I think even just as a queer person coming into a church structure, even just a building, I think it might, even just having folks who are wearing like a rainbow sticker, or, because I think we can always say like, okay, this church is open and affirming, but what does it mean when I sit next to somebody? Like, what does that mean, and how can we communicate that? I've had a lot of people that I have them watching your guys' live stream of your services, because I think it's a start to getting people comfortable, because we've got to heal from whatever the past was. But like, get a feel for it. You don't have to be there, but you can get a feel for it through some of the videos and the content that you guys put out, which is great, because not all churches do that. So that having that aspect has been, I know it probably originated out of COVID, but it's been very helpful for my community as we look at healing some of our spirituality harms that have happened, but there are safe places out there, and people are struggling with like, how safe is it? And I'm like, just give it a feel. But I think maybe just even like little things like that it gives people a sense of like, okay, I know like when I go to the doctor's office, if I see someone drawing my blood who has, okay, I know that if something happens here, I can talk to you. That you can help me navigate this.
David, I want to say really briefly in response to that there's a really beautiful, hopeful, lovely response to what you are saying based on the kids who are hanging out in that youth center and what they insist upon. It is our job to support that and to do that, but in our particular case, in our particular community, they are the ones leading this. They are the ones making sure I'm on board, making sure pastor's on board, making sure anybody who else comes into our space. So they're doing this work. They are engaged and insist upon it.
Capitalize on their work for everybody in this or any congregation that's 4 times their age. Youth is very, very smart.
Yeah.
They get it.
Yeah, they're probably not having a problem.
They have to take their
They aren't.
They're there.
Yeah.
They're there. Yeah. The follow-up is thank you for saying that and asking that and caring about that. So.
Yeah,
Yeah, one quick thing. I worked at IPFW before, it was PFW for a while, and we had a certain series of classes we could go to with people that wanted to identify their office as a safe place. And we had a rainbow insignia on our office door, which indicated to students that this was a safe place to come and talk about issues. And if there's a way we could sort of identify our church as a safe place.
We happen to have a sign that says safe place. It's not exactly from that.
Do youth
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
note it? Do they know what the Human Rights Campaign equal sign is? Do they know that or no?
Some of them do, but they're used to seeing more of the rainbow because the human rights, the equality sticker was like before we could necessarily be out.
Okay. So I used to have one of those in my office, and the kids were like, "What's
Yeah.
that?"
Yeah.
We don't have to make a Japanese anime and make it like TikTok and anything.
I mean, if you want to be cool, that's a whole other realm. I haven't reached cool yet, but yeah.
We promised Chris that he would be done at 4:30.